Psychedelic drugs are definitely back on the menu. All you have to do is open the pages of a newspaper these days, it seems, and you can read about microdosing, ayahuasca, new coming psychedelic therapy. That's a good thing, isn't it? But what was the first psychedelic? We're going to find out today in this episode of The Bureau of Lost Culture. The Bureau of Lost Culture, dedicated to recollecting, unearthing, digging up, remembering half-forgotten or lost countercultural stories. I'm Stephen Coates, and I'm here with my collaborator, Paul Hartfield, who says he's not high, but he maybe.
For a change, no. Hi, Stephen.
Good, and we are here with, let's call him the historian of psychoactive plants, Mike J. Hello, Mike.
Hello, Stephen. Pleasure to be here.
And Mike, we are specifically talking about, because you've just published this amazing new book, the history of mescaline, right? But before we dig into that and go on that sort of particular trip, who are you? I mean, and I'm not even going to try and sum you up. I mean, I know you're a historian of science, but I mean, specifically, how did you get to this, to writing this amazing history of mescaline?
Oh, it's a really strange journey that doesn't really make any sense with hindsight. But I sort of became the drugs guy quite a long time ago, back in the 90s, when actually I was mostly working in film and TV and editing and stuff, but I was doing bits of journalism, so I was writing a bit for things like Arena at the time, and Fortean Times, as I was still a perennial favourite, one of the first people to actually pay me to write anything. And back in that day, we think back to the 90s and we think, oh, drug culture was everywhere, but actually nobody was really writing about it at the time very much. There was, and I was also an early adopter on the internet, so back in the sort of pre-Windows, C:// days. So I sort of wrote a bit about all the kind of, Usenet drugs forums on the internet in the early days, because that was really the first time that anybody started talking about drugs and drug culture. And then once I started doing that, then people asked me to write more about it. And weird to remember it now, but everybody was going, "You're mad writing about drugs. The police will put your name on a list. You'll be arrested," and
For just writing about drugs?
Yeah, back in those days, it was not long, that was only a few years after, the sort of Thatcher era of kind of books about drugs being, from America, being seized in transit and destroyed. It was still had a kind of very censored sort of underground feel to it.
The reaction against ecstasy and the repetitive beats and all that stuff going on.
Yeah, that's right. And there was very few people, actually talking about what this was and where it had come from. So that sort of slightly became my patch, and I sort of woke up to the fact that these, drugs were not actually invented by hippies in the 60s, that all these things that were illicit drugs actually had like long histories of their own, in most cases they'd been perfectly legal for a long time, used by all kinds of people, scientists and artists and sort of poets and writers and anthropologists had just discovered, so I started digging into all that history, and that's how I kind of became the guy who writes about drugs. I do write about lots of other things, so it's kind of a way of it's just you can say you're writing about drugs, but you're always writing really about something else, and it's just like all full of, you're just cherry picking all the most exciting bits, for me.
So it's like looking at culture, but through the lens of drugs.
Yeah, pretty much.
You have tended to specialise. I'm thinking about that amazing exhibition which you curated down at Kew. You've tended to go for the more sort of psychoactive plant end of drugs rather than the kind of synthesised bit, haven't you?
Yeah, that once you go far enough back into the history, it's kind of all like that. And yeah, I curated that High Society exhibition at the Wellcome as well, which was sort of trying to sort of open the subject up and make it more global. And then you get into cat chewing in Africa and sort of betel nut and coca in the Andes and all those. But I have also written about the synthetic stuff. I wrote a book about nitrous oxide, the discovery of nitrous oxide, which was the first synthetic drug to be made in the laboratory.
That was the atmosphere of heaven, was it?
Yeah, that's right. The atmosphere of heaven. And so one of the things about mescaline as a subject is it's got both. Half of it is about, the cacti, the peyote in the San Pedro that have been around and used forever in sort of Mexico and South America, and then the other half is about, the mescaline, the drug that was synthesized from them
Right.
100 years ago in the lab. So you've got kind of both stories there, which is really interesting for me.
Before we dig specifically into the history of mescaline, it is interesting, isn't it? So you curated an exhibition at Kew. You're working with the Welcome, and that all seems to signal that in some way, this thing I mentioned at the beginning, that psychedelic substances are back in the news, back on the menu. It feels almost as though it's only a matter of time now before, say, psilocybin gets licensed for therapeutic use, even MDMA possibly too. It does feel like we are on the sort of brink of a new psychedelic era. And why don't we start to dig in? I mean, we're here really to talk about your book and mescaline. And I suppose for anybody who doesn't really know what mescaline is, Mike, and you have described it as the first psychedelic. So maybe we can start with that. I mean, just set out the stall for mescaline.
Well, mescaline is a chemical compound or a drug or a sacrament or a medicine or whatever you want to call it. It's kind of found in nature, weirdly enough, only in cacti and only in kind of two species of cacti. The famous one is the peyote cactus, which grows in Mexico and a bit of Texas. And there's also the San Pedro cactus, which grows in the Andes. And yeah, as I mentioned, about exactly 100 years ago, actually, in 1919, it was first synthesized in the laboratory. So it also exists as a sort of pure white powder, as a chemical. And it was probably the most famous mescaline trip still was Aldous Huxley's. In 1953, he took some mescaline, the powder dissolved in water, at his house in the Hollywood Hills, and had the most amazing experiences of his life. He said, it was like he'd never seen the world like that before. He said it's what Adam must have seen on the morning of creation, and he wrote The Doors of Perception, which is his famous account of this, after which he and Humphrey Osmond, who was the psychiatrist who'd given it to him, batted around ideas for like a new name for these kinds of drugs, and these kinds of drugs at this point included mescaline and another drug that had been much more recently synthesized in the laboratory called LSD. And these two drugs were at that time used in psychiatry, and there was a whole theory that their effects were similar to the symptoms of schizophrenia. So maybe if schizophrenia had a chemical cause, it was something like this. So all the language that was around mescaline and LSD connected it to sort of mental illness, and Aldous Huxley said, that's wrong. My experience was not like being mentally ill. My experience was like a mystical experience, like people have described in Eastern spiritual traditions through the ages. So they kicked around for a word and came up with the word psychedelic, which meaning sort of mind expanding or sort of mind manifesting. And so at that point, LSD and mescaline were the only two psychedelics. Things like psilocybin and DMT, hadn't been synthesized yet at that point. And of those two, LSD was the one that had been recently discovered in the lab, and mescaline was the one with a long history. So that, in that sense, the first psychedelic.
It's interesting as well that Huxley was virtually blind as well, wasn't he?
Yeah.
By that point. So a brave thing to do, I would say, as a
it was
sighted person. I mean, to take a new substance like that and open your doors to it.
Yeah, he was. It was interesting. He was very poorly sighted, and one of the other really famous philosophers to take mescaline earlier, back in the 30s, Jean-Paul Sartre, was also really poorly sighted. They had very different experiences, but I think Huxley's was interesting because not only was he kind of partially sighted, but he said, by his own account, he said, I'm a very poor visualizer. So he'd read all this like long literature about mescaline, which is all about, you close your eyes and you see this kaleidoscope of hallucinations and visions and patterns and incredible colours. And Huxley said, I didn't get any of that. I just opened my eyes and the world was just transformed. It was like it had been all freshly made, and I'd never seen it this way before.
Did he carry on using it then?
Yeah, he did, but then A lot of people at that time, this is kind of the time when mescaline becomes sort of world famous and lots of people talking about it and taking it. But actually, scientists by this point were already starting to switch over to LSD in preference. And that's what Huxley did after he tried LSD. He never went back to mescaline, and he carried on taking LSD and famously took it on his deathbed.
Administered by his wife.
That's right, and just at the moment when JFK was being shot. So
that's right. Yeah. And C.S. Lewis was doing something or other. He died, I think, didn't he, on the same day? There was three things happened on the same day.
That's
C.S. Lewis died, JFK got killed, and Aldous Huxley died whilst taking acid. Paul, would you be tempted to ask Ali, your wife, to inject you with LSD on your deathbed?
She'd happily do that, I'm sure. No, I'd be very up for that. I'd like to see what I missed, or see what I did, or what I did bad, or I'm sure that will happen on my bed.
It's a bold thing to do, though, isn't it? I mean, for most people, I think the sort of you imagine that the experience of dying is quite intense, but then to augment it with acid.
I would see it as a release, and I would see it as it would be doubled if I took LSD.
Well, I'm hoping I'm there to witness it.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun. I think it's hard to second guess until the moment you get there. I mean, my father-in-law, who was old beatnik and kind of just used every drug he could get his hands on, and when he sort of finally got his sort of terminal cancer diagnosis, we were like, well, come on, Derek, now's your moment. You can order anything up off the dock and get a script. And actually, when it came to it, he was like, no, I'm good. I'll just... So, you might sort of project forward to the moment of your death and think, oh, I would want to do this. But, when it comes to it, you might actually want to...
have a cup of tea.
Go in bareback, as it were. Yeah.
Right. Interesting image. Mike, but why did they, as it were, why did LSD for Huxley and for the scientists become the psychedelic substance of choice then over mescaline?
It's mostly a question of dose. Mescaline, a gram of mescaline is about 3 doses. Same sort of dosage as MDMA. It's a big fat pill if you want to take it. A gram of LSD is just thousands of doses, as you know. It's like tiny amount, a little bit on blotting paper. So it starts to be preferred. I mean, partly obviously then for logistical reasons. You're going to buy a gram of LSD rather than a gram of mescaline because that'll last you sort of through all your sort of clinical trials. But also for scientists, it was like the theory with mescaline had always been for decades that a bit like sort of cannabis or something, if you eat a lot of it, it just kind of floods the brain with sort of weird stimuli and kind of, that's why you have these hallucinations and kind of, strange sort of trippy states. Whereas LSD, scientists went, well, this works in such tiny doses, it's got to be stimulating some particular kind of receptor or triggering something very specific in the brain. So it became more interesting for scientists to use LSD to try and zero down on exactly what it was doing.
So this is the synthesized mescaline, obviously. Let's go back even further. I mean, it was from an organic root, which had been synthesized in the lab. So tell us about the differences between the synthesized version and the organic cacti version.
Yeah, well, both the cacti, the peyote and the San Pedro, have lots of different chemicals in them. Alkaloids, they're called a type of chemical which are often mind-altering, so there's an alkaloid in coffee called caffeine, and there's an alkaloid in tobacco called nicotine, and in the peyote and San Pedro there's mescaline, but there's also dozens of other alkaloids. And various people have argued that this kind of has a sort of rather different, gives it different qualities from sort of synthetic mescaline. Having tried it out, I have to say, I did most of my sort of early experiences with San Pedro cactus in Peru and also, in other places. And, it's it's kind of... it's definitely a psychedelic, but it's a different family from LSD and psilocybin and stuff. It's a slightly different sensation. It's much more physical MDMA, as we might discuss later, is a sort of analogue of it. It's got this thing. It's kind of more a sort of body high as well as a mental thing, and the physical experience of it is can be quite euphoric and really pleasant, but it can also be quite nauseous and sort of overwhelming. So and I always when I took San Pedro, I thought, I wonder what it would be like to take pure mescaline, because then you just get like the head trip without any of this kind of body load. But then when I did take, mescaline sulfate, immediately recognised, oh, okay, these are both in, the pure drug itself. So
you'd have a physical reaction too, you mean?
Yeah. I mean, as you do with sort of ecstasy or something, you feel a kind of sort of heaviness in the body and a sort of tingling in the extremities and a sort of bit of a sort of heartbeat. If it's a large dose, you can be quite sort of physically steamrollered, and have to lie down, all that.
Is it a
all
fast
that kind of stuff.
roller coaster, or is it a slow change from panic to ecstasy?
It's really slow. It's much slower to cross the blood-brain barrier than kind of LSD and psilocybin and things. So it's really a couple of hours before you've got the measure of, how much you just took. And it also lasts longer. It lasts about 12 hours. Okay. So it's pretty, it's pretty much more of a physical ordeal, I mean, I did it. I was very generously invited by the Native American Church in Oklahoma to participate in one of their ceremonies, and that's an all-night ceremony based around, the peyote as its sacrament, and 12 hours, in a teepee, sitting cross-legged, upright and focused is pretty intense.
So a ritual is quite part of you would recommend that?
I think it's I think it's bigger than, the difference between, the cactus material and the chemical. There are lots of kind of psychedelic geeks who will argue about that forever, but to me, the sort of big difference is the context in which you take it, because if you take it sort of on your own or experimentally, or let's see what's going to happen to me, then you get very wrapped up in your own sensations, because you get everything from, when you close your eyes, you start to see these amazingly sort of vivid visions. You get lots of auditory hallucinations, or I do. It's like kind of having a, radio being tuned kind of inside a brain, all picking up all kinds of snatches of things, and you get kind of very wrapped up in all this. Whereas if you take it in a ritual, it's a collective experience, and in fact, there's kind of, the roadmen in the Native American Church, the sort of facilitators, always say, don't focus on your own sensations, sort of be with what's happening, be with the music, be with the prayers, be with the group. So I think, in a way that, the context in which you take it makes more difference than whether it's a cactus or a chemical.
Right. So, with acid, the thing was all set and setting, wasn't it? So, set up the context in which you take it, make sure you're in a lovely environment, preferably with lovely people, and, maybe with somebody who's more experienced. And this is a sort of setting you're talking about there, which went back for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it's seen as a sacrament, not a drug. And it's a communal act, not an individual act, very different than the Huxley version of it, right? It's maybe physically much more demanding. Not just in terms of the stuff that it does to you, whether it makes you feel nauseous and throw up, but also, sitting upright is for 12 hours. I'm not sure I can manage that.
It's hard. No, as the roadman said in the ceremony, it's like, suffering is part of the point of it. This is not supposed to be easy, It's just like, and there is something about everybody going through an ordeal together that's very powerful. Interestingly, the Native American Church ceremony doesn't go back hundreds of years. It was it actually only appeared on the reservations, in the 1880s, because that was the first time that most, American, plains tribes had encountered peyote, and it was, it was to do with the Texas Railroad, that sort of peyote, was only really known to the people who lived down in Mexico or kind of down on the Tex-Mex border, but it does go back a really long way in Mexico, and it goes back a really long way in the Andes, the San Pedro as well. And in Mexico, and there seem to have been kind of two different ways it was used, and it was banned by the Mexican Inquisition But there are records from Jesuit priests of like everybody taking it, usually around a fire, usually at night, and kind of dancing and singing and getting into this kind of group mind thing, and you can't help now with hindsight, like sort of thinking about kind of, the use of sort of mescaline derivative drugs in sort of modern dance scene, it's kind of very similar.
Ecstasy in the rave scene.
That's right.
So that's the earliest history, because it's the earliest written history.
That's right.
That you can trace the use of mescaline back to, or the peyote, or the San Pedro, because obviously pre that there was no records. So there's no in those early races. There's no records that they kept about the uses, or rather.
Well, there is. I mean, you can follow it back, with art and architecture for thousands of years. There's this amazing temple site in the Andes in Peru called Chavin, and which is about 3,000 years old, and there's carvings on the temple walls of this kind of sort of shaman figure who's kind of half human but with sort of jaguar fangs, holding a San Pedro cactus, and there's kind of physical finds of cacti going way back, and peyote in Mexico going back, at least sort of 3,000-4,000 years, and in the Andes there's lots of pottery and ceramics with kind of San Pedro sort of intertwined with jaguars and things. So we know it was there, but it's very hard to reconstruct exactly what it meant, what that experience was. So it's only with the first European encounter with it was with the Aztecs, as they called them, in Mexico, and that's the first time that you get people saying, well, there's this cactus called the peyote, and when they eat it they see visions, and this is how they use it, and all that.
And why were they so keen to stamp it out? Because
they had come from Europe in the height of the witch craze, and their interpretation of the visions that it produced was that they were given to them by the devil. But it was also very weird for them to work out, because, when they saw a peyote ceremony, well, you'd have people sitting around, you'd have these priests with this, who were handing the peyote out to everybody as a sacrament, and they'd receive it with sort of downcast eyes and prayers, and they'd burn copal incense. It was like frankincense. It was like, so how come we've just come halfway around the world, and there are these people who don't know anything about God or Jesus just having a communion? What's that about? So I think, that was why, their interpretation was, well, it's kind of, the devil is sort of mocking them. It's kind of a parody of the sacrament, and but it was also, I think, really about you had to kind of give up the peyote before you could properly convert to Christianity. They could see that it was a rival, that people, regarded peyote as sacred. And in fact, this comes back, the Native American church these days are much more explicit about that. They say, Christ's crucifixion, that's the white man's sin. That was nothing to do with us. We don't have to atone for that.
Wise words.
We've always had a different, and the peyote has always been our sacrament. That's the way in which, Jesus has always been with us. So you can see that there's been a sort of turf war between peyote and Christianity in that part of the world ever since.
We're going to hear some sounds, Mike, which are related to mescaline. Can you just tell us what they are?
This is going to be some music from the Native American church, the peyote ceremonies. And this is a type of music that kind of developed as the peyote ceremony did during the late 19th century, when the Plains tribes were on the reservations. At that point, a lot of their traditional ceremonies had been banned. They weren't allowed to do singing or dancing, on the reservation. So, this ceremony happening in a teepee at night was a kind of clandestine thing. It was like a little world in which you could create, the old ways and the old times and the old medicine. And this is still a big component of Native American church ceremonies to this day. People sing, and there are two sacred instruments that are passed around, a rattle and a drum, and they're passed around the circle, and people sing their songs. Everybody's song is different. Often they are songs about their own lineage or their own tribe. There are certain songs that people are entitled to sing about themselves. And also, when you've got this going inside a teepee, inside a canvas teepee, or as it would have been in the old days, a buffalo hide teepee, it's just amazing the way that it echoes back. And particularly as the peyote takes hold, what you hear in this, I heard sort of through the night so many amazing kind of phrases and songs and, things being created around this very basic kind of singing and beat. And that's the thing with a lot of the great peyote songs, is that they are kind of received or channeled, during previous ceremonies. And so it's a kind of a very specific sort of musical style, but it's sort of it's really worked to the occasion and to the place, and it also kind of generates more forms and more songs as it goes along.
Let's have a listen. Sounds like none of the Christians actually tried it then, because if they had tried it, they might have had a very different view on it, right?
Yeah, that's
amazing.
That's absolutely right. There's no record of them actually trying it. It's just assumed that this is a savage practice and something that if people want to become civilized, they have to stop. And this is also true on the Native American reservations in the 19th century. The missionaries were always trying to stamp out peyote, and because they thought, well, as long as these Indians stay in their teepees kind of with their peyote worship, they're never going to come to the mission schools or send their children to the church or kind of become proper Americans.
Reminds me of Graham Hancock's thing about we should insist that all our politicians should drink ayahuasca 3 times before they take power.
Well, I think unfortunately psychedelics don't. That's kind of like saying if everybody took psychedelics, then everyone would agree with me. I don't think it quite works like that. I think they sort of psychedelics tend to kind of intensify what people feel already, and you really see that in this long literature on mescaline. If people are having a great time, it's an amazing cosmic time, but if people are having a bad time, it's an absolute nightmare.
Well, that's a good time actually to maybe we can hear a couple of people's experiences. Let's start with a good one. And Mike, take us to the world of mescaline in London and have a look. Ellis.
Yeah, this is kind of really the first Western encounter with psychedelics. I've always found this really fascinating because you think, well, when was that? The 1950s? But no, actually it's the 1890s, because this is the time when it was actually a sort of ethnologist from the Smithsonian Institution who was out in Oklahoma and was the first white man to participate in a peyote ceremony and brought peyote back to the Smithsonian, back to Washington, D.C., and that was when scientists first started to experiment with it. And a very famous American neurologist took it and wrote up a report about these incredible visions that he'd had, and it was published in the British Medical Journal, at which point in London, Havelock Ellis, who was a doctor, but he was also a kind of cultural critic and writer, became interested in this and tracked some down, and that was and took it. He was staying with his friend Arthur Symons in the Temple in Fountain Court, and that was sort of the first major psychedelic that was ever taken in London in 1897. And Havelock Ellis had an amazing time with it, wrote a beautiful description of it, and then thought this would be very interesting to try on some of my friends. So he gave it to a friend who was an artist to see if he'd paint the visions that he saw, and also a couple of his friends who were poets, W.B. Yeats and Arthur Symons. They also took it, and Arthur Symons had a fantastic experience, which Havelock Ellis then wrote up and told us about.
Late that evening, Symonds walked from Fountain Court down to the nearby Thames embankment. As he gazed across the south bank, he found himself absolutely fascinated by the advertisement of Bovril, which came and went in letters of light on the other side of the river. The brilliance of electricity was the ruling metaphor for peyote's scintillating visions, but it was a literal stimulus too. It seemed that nothing delighted the eye of the mescal eater so much as the new electrical sublime. They arrived together as avatars of a new world, of a visual spectacle, equal parts scientific discovery and sensory delight.
Wonderful stuff. And I mean, we were talking earlier about the inclusion of Bovril, beef extract, advertised across the river. It seems an odd combination, Mike, but as we were discussing, Vril, the Vril of the Bovril, was at the time, or coming from this idea of some sort of spiritual, vital essence, right? So it must have rung a few bells for Symons then.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the idea of Vril and Vril power was introduced to the culture by the novelist Bulwer Lytton, who wrote this novel called The Coming Race, about going down into the hollow earth and meeting this race of superior beings who it's a kind of utopian world that they live in down there, where there's no sort of fighting or war because everybody's got this incredible sort of source of energy called Vril power. And this was a kind of concept that was picked up, as you said, by sort of vitalists and some scientists, but also by theosophists and kind of occultists. So when this beef extract was being named, for whatever reason they chose to call it Bovril, bovine vril, like this was the essence of cow, in a bottle.
Managed to get it into a jar.
Yeah.
And now, I mean, for people who know that part of London, it is, of course, where the Oxo Tower is. Another beef extract, I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, strange.
That's right.
That was a very happy experience for Symonds, and obviously Havelock Ellis, and you said introducing it to this culture, this poetic, artistic culture of London. And talk me a bit more, Mike, about the effects that had in terms of the work that they were producing, and in fact the effect that Mescaline has had on artists.
Yeah, it was. That's kind of. I think that's really interesting. That's the first time that a sort of artistic scene kind of started to develop around psychedelics, and they were all very much enthralled to decadence and symbolism and those kind of movements of the time. And then you get a lot more in the 1920s after mescaline becomes available as a as a chemical, as a white powder. Psychologists started using it a lot to giving it to people and getting them to sort of describe their experiences, and they got particularly interested in the sort of visual hallucinations and trying to get people to describe that, because one of the things that psychologists realised was if you give somebody a lot of mescaline, and then they then tell them to close their eyes and you say, what are you seeing? And people will say things like, well, I can see all these silver hoops all sort of spinning clockwise, and then there's this really bright light in the middle of all of them, and now they're turning into snakes, and the snakes are sticking their tongues out, and they're bouncing these balls up. People can talk like this for hours and hours and hours, and it was like, wow, where is all this stuff coming from? What is this? Is this some kind of unconscious projection from the particular subject, or is this just some kind of mechanical thing that the drug does in the brain, and what does that tell us about how the brain works? So there's this kind of loads of sort of scientific experiments with mescaline, and then psychologists start to realize that what they really need is people who can interpret this. So that's when it gets given to philosophers, people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Walter Benjamin, to describe what they think is going on, but also particularly to artists, because the idea is that artists can draw what they're seeing. And you've got a lot of particularly modernist avant-garde artists, particularly people who are interested in productions of the unconscious, the sort of people who are doing automatic writing and drawing, so in that kind of avant-garde art world between the wars, there are a lot of mescaline experiments and people producing amazing work. And there's one that I've kind of looked at particularly because there's it's all recorded in the archives of the sort of Maudsley Psychiatric Hospital here in London. There were a couple of psychiatrists there in the 1930s who were studying hallucinations, because hallucinations are a kind of thing that only happen to people normally in weird states of mind, either when they're psychotic or having a high fever or something, and they're trying to work out what was going on, and they thought, well, mescaline produces hallucinations, so why don't we give mescaline to some artists and see if they can show us what they're seeing. And they chose surrealist artists because they thought, well, they'll be interested in the unconscious. These I did a exhibition down at the Bethlehem Museum of the Mind earlier this year of the work that they produced. Several artists producing work on mescaline, and a couple of them left records of the experience they had. And one of them, Julian Trevelyan, wrote in his memoirs about it and said it was an amazing experience. As soon as the mescaline took hold, he was like, he just couldn't put a line wrong. It was like he was kind of drawing in 3D in midair, and everything was kind of perfect. And then the other one, Basil Beaumont, had a sort of experience that started similarly. He was taken to the Maudsley and injected with at 10 in the morning with some mescaline, and but it all played out very differently.
Yeah, let's hear it from Paul.
Basil Beaumont's experiment began identically with an injection at 10 o'clock, but unfolded quite differently. He felt sick, cold and shivery, afflicted with twitching feet and hands, and a feeling of paralysis around the injection site. The trees outside the window became waving serpentine forms of octopuses, and the walls of the room filled with Aztec designs that put me in mind of human sacrifice. Colour formations unfurled, never reaching a climax, pure colour and sound without orchestration, rest or pause, almost unendurable. Excruciating pain and fear blended with exquisite beauty of form and sound in ways that you found impossible to communicate. It was too painful and too wonderful. Time went very wrong, expanding and contracting. Doctors came in and out, asking him questions. Dr. Gutmann appeared as a most diabolical goat, though Beaumont was keenly aware that he remained his only connection to sanity. At Gutmann's insistence, over Beaumont's objections, they went for lunch. The walk to the canteen was interminably long. Through undulating corridors, Beaumont was seated at a table with Gutmann and another experimental subject who kept asking, "And is this the state actually known as a psychosis, doctor?" Other doctors arrived. Beaumont recalled that, "I thought they were making fun of me. Then I thought they were mental patients. Finally, I decided that they had all been injected with a drug." Tea in the clubroom, amid conversation about fascism, communism, and the Jews.
It didn't sound too bad at the start, but it sort of got worse and worse and worse. But I mean, who would want to be tripping and then your companion says to you, is this what they call psychosis? And then starts talking about the Holocaust. It's not, it's a sort of set and setting thing again, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, very much. I always find these fascinating because now kind of we know, oh, that's an acid trip or whatever. We know how it goes. But when you go back to the 1930s when people had no idea what this was or how you were supposed to deal with it, and the psychiatrists just think, well, I'll just inject them with this drug and, see what happens, But
and then take them to the canteen.
But yeah, that's right. And Julian Trevelyan, the one who had a great experience, goes to the canteen and he says he just spent hours staring at the cauliflower and the spaghetti and, admiring their forms and thinking how wonderful they were, whereas you can see the same experience for Basil Beaumont is just a complete nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to spend too long looking at cauliflower cheese, do you, in a canteen? No,
that's right. And it's the, I think that's the, there's a lot of scientific experiments with mescaline going back, way before, sort of to the beginning of the 20th century. And, this is definitely a thread through them, that it's very hard for science to understand, a drug that has such different effects on different people, because normally a drug basically does the same thing to everybody. If it lowers your blood pressure, it lowers everybody's blood pressure. Then, even, like sort of Valium or something isn't like a stimulant for some people and a sedative for others. It is what it is. So from the very beginning, you get these amazing experiments where, a series of subjects get given mescaline, and some of them have an amazing experience and some of them have a complete nightmare.
It's probably too big a scope for this conversation, but we could just dip our toes into the water. When these experiences, Mike, in terms of the imagery, you talk about seeing Aztec-style imagery. Well, if you've drunk ayahuasca, you're familiar with that stuff as well. What is going on? I mean, maybe you can speculate a little bit. Is there something which is cross-cultural going on? Is there something which is like other, or is it a kind of, there's just a subjective playing out of imageries which there's no real meaning to or explanation of? It's just some wonderful thing that happens, like some light show. Or is there something deeper, you think, which is some contact with some spirit consciousness?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a question that kind of keeps coming up, through the history of mescaline, because people interpret them in such different ways, and we're now kind of being shown all this kind of high-tech brain imaging and shown, oh, look, it's this bit of your brain talking to that bit of your brain, or whatever, And it's interesting to look at this from the sort of indigenous traditions as well, where the whole conversation just seems very crude to them and very reductive. It's like it's not just like the drug in the cactus. It's like the whole thing. It's the ritual. It's the event. It's everybody else who's involved. In the whole experience, and it's very much connected with sort of telepathy and kind of precognitive powers and being able to see things at a distance, so there are so many different frameworks, and I think that's one of the things about that you see kind of when you put those traditions side to side with like our modern Western ones, you can see that we have to kind of invent a framework to explain what's going on. Whenever we take a psychedelic, it's like, oh, this is a sacrament and I'm going to have a religious experience, or oh, this is a medicine and it's going to make me better, or oh, I'm going to take this and make some art. We have all these different kind of choices, and you get this all through the science of mescaline as well, that people start off thinking, oh, this is going to open up the unconscious, I'm going to understand different personality types, and your hallucinations are going to tell me about you, and then it's like, well, hang on, everybody has these hallucinations which are kind of quite similar and they don't seem to really relate to the subject, so where are they coming from? And is it just like a mechanical production of the brain that these things just disrupt our sensors, and then we kind of make signal out of noise and create these images? But then and in fact, quite a lot of scientists who kind of put that forward also say, yeah, but this doesn't really explain everything. It might explain why we see these geometrical shapes, but taking a psychedelic is not like looking down a kaleidoscope. It feels really important. It feels really kind of deep
meaningful
and profound. You're really kind of, having this experience that's very deep and stays with you. So, how do we explain that? So I think all these things are kind of going on with psychedelics, and our tendency, sort of, in our sort of Western culture, is to sort of pick one model or another, and but it doesn't. It always seems to me that you can't really contain the experience within just one way of looking at it.
I mean, one of the things which people we've interviewed for this program in terms of the psychedelic underground of the 60s, not necessarily connected with mescaline, but specifically with acid, is that you see the amazing culturally positive effect that acid had, just in terms of music and in terms of graphic design and clothing and a kind of general consciousness raising, out of which came all sorts of political changes like the ecology movement, feminism, all sorts of stuff. Had to some extent had their roots in acid, right?
Yeah.
So there is something communal and meaningful going on there too. But I was just wondering specifically, just thinking about my own experiences, that the imagery which we would lazily and loosely describe as Aztec or South American, Why that? Because I mean, I've not even been to South America. I've not seen those places. I'm peripherally aware of them. Why would those visions include that kind of iconography and imagery? Or is it that kind of imagery and iconography informed those South American cultures in the first place? The big one for Mike. Go on.
Yeah,
Give it a go, Mike.
Yeah, well, I think for us it's kind of priming. I mean, mescaline and particularly peyote came to everybody in the West with the knowledge that this was something that had been used by the Aztecs, and so you get quite a lot of, like Basil Beaumont, when he's having his nightmarish experience, suddenly kind of gets the idea that he's going to be sacrificed by these doctors, you know. So I think some of that is cultural priming and association. I think, you know, there's certainly like a lot of, in Mexican art, like the witch hole art that you can look at and go, wow, that is so psychedelic. But there's also a lot of art from other cultures that don't use psychedelics that look like that. And, you know, in terms of the sort of Western subcultures, you know, what's interesting is in the 1950s when mescaline and LSD are both being used and picked up, you know, they're used a lot by mostly sort of people who are kind of cultural conservatives one way or another. You know, a lot of those big figures, you know, Huxley to an extent, and also Gordon Wasson, who discovered magic mushrooms, and you know, Albert Hoffman, who discovered LSD. You know, they're all people who are far from being kind of left-wing radicals. You know, in fact, they're mostly people who think that, you know, society is degenerate, and you know we need to give these drugs to the bright young people of the next generation in order to, you know, there's kind of quite a sort of right-wing ideology behind a lot of that. And of course, you know, the CIA are very involved in the distribution of psychedelics. And then in the 60s, it develops this completely different culture. So I don't think psychedelics in themselves, you know, produced kind of sort of, you know, left-leaning, ecologically conscious cultures, you know, because there's lots of examples, you know, of it being used in other cultures where that's not the message. You know, I mean, it's like, you know, today lots of you know, in Russia, there are lots of kind of neo-Nazi sort of biker gangs who are very into their psychedelics. I don't think they're having the same kind of warm, fuzzy, tree-hugging experience that you know, people are in, you know, here in you know, in London or California or wherever today.
I don't know about you, Paul, but next time we're in Russia, I don't want to meet any Russian biker gangs who are on
not
psychedelic drugs.
One project we're not doing.
Interesting though it is, actually.
Yeah, but also, you know, within paganism, you know, there's as often discussed, you know, there's quite a sort of nationalist and kind of alt-right strand developing, you know, and that's, I think, is probably reinforced as much. I mean, you know, psychedelics, I think, just kind of, you know, powerfully reinforce your subjective experience, whatever it is, you know. So if your subjective experience and your beliefs are, you know, that, you know, we all need to kind of come together communally and save the planet, I think they're incredibly powerful in spreading that message. But that's not the only message that, you know, people are interested in.
So mescaline gets superseded largely by LSD in the culture. I mean, it's always going on, as you said. Psychedelics are always there. There's always people experimenting and using it, in maybe including yourself, and it's going along. And then you talked before about that in some way, sort of fast forward to late 80s and 90s, that MDMA and ecstasy as a sort of analogue of, they become an analogue of mescaline, and that became very significant in the culture, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, when psychedelic culture really kicked off in the 60s, then LSD replaced mescaline for exactly the same reasons as it had replaced it in science. You know, if you're an underground chemist and you're going to make, you know, 10 grams of something, you know, 10 grams of mescaline would basically do you and a few of your mates. You know, 10 grams of LSD would kind of do, you know, sort of tens of thousands of people. Yeah, exactly, or the whole of Woodstock or whatever, you know. So, of course, LSD becomes the thing. Mescaline kind of still has this cachet. It becomes kind of, you know, this sort of legendary substance, good because of Huxley and Doors of Perception. Everybody, you know, knows it was the first psychedelic, and so you get a lot of stuff that's sold as mescaline, and you know, in the late 60s and in the 70s, but it probably wasn't. You know, I mean, there were some underground chemists who made little batches for sort of, you know, connoisseurs, you know, so it did kind of exist. But, you know, lots of stuff was kind of sold as mescaline that was, whatever, who knows what it was. I combed through all the Drug Enforcement Agency had a very helpful bulletin that ran all through the sort of 60s and 70s of all their sort of busts and, sort of chemical analysis of all their sort of street seizures, and there wasn't any mescaline in there. So it had become this thing that, as we were sort of discussing earlier, Hunter S. Thompson goes, and then we took some mescaline. It was this kind of legendary, kind of crazy thing, that everybody had heard of, but nobody had taken. But I think the most significant mescaline trip in the 60s was the one that was the chemist Alexander Shulgin. It was his first psychedelic experience, and he took it in 1960, and he said that totally changed the course of my life. It was the most amazing thing. And also because he was a chemist, he looked at it and he went, well, hang on, nobody's really tried sort of to synthesize other variants on this or analogues of this. So he started tinkering around and very famously came up with MDMA, ecstasy, but also, 2CB and 2CT7 and all these other phenethylamines. They're called the same kind of group. And I think in many ways you can see these as kind of mescaline sort of tamed for the chemical generation, because instead of being this kind of sort of physical ordeal that goes on for 12 hours, it's 3 or 4 hours. Some people find it a bit nauseous or physically weird, but it's also got that euphoria that mescaline has, and it's kind of manageable and it's in a pill. So it's interesting. So I think, from when sort of dance drugs pick up in the 80s, in a way that's like the sort of commoditized kind of chemical sort of form of mescaline, and you see how it develops a very different culture, much more physical, much more about dance and movement, whereas kind of sort of acid culture is pretty cerebral and pretty white and pretty male, then when they MDMA and these other dance drugs come along, you get a very different collective feel and a very different kind of much more diverse crowd of people attracted to it.
But interestingly, of course, that has a massive effect on the culture, doesn't it? In terms of music,
absolutely.
and I mean, it was that kind of enlightened a whole new generation, didn't it? MDMA and ecstasy, and of course now is still now being on the brink of being used in therapy, and so mescaline has kind of followed this route, and even though it's still out there and doing its own thing, its effect is still echoing through the culture.
Yeah, very much. And it's interesting that nobody's really using mescaline in kind of this new psychedelic renaissance and all these new clinical trials, and that's partly, I think, because it was there early. It was banned very early, so legally it's kind of very hard one to deal with, compared to something like ketamine, which has always been kind of has always had been a medicine that's been kind of you have to use it off label if you want to use it in psychedelic therapy, but it's been much easier in terms of bureaucracy to use something like ketamine. Something like psilocybin is kind of one of the reasons that people went for that, was because it sounds very sciencey. You don't say magic mushrooms, even though that's what it is. But it's always been quite hard to use things that people know are acid or ecstasy or whatever. And mescaline, I think, is a bit the same. So it's kind of bowed out. It's kind of disappeared, or you could say it's been kind of designed out, by these sort of new things like MDMA and these new chemicals that have sort of selected some of its qualities in a more manageable form.
Mike, we're running out of time, but I thought it'd be quite nice just to hear your anecdote about your father-in-law and his experience.
Oh yeah, that was my uncle actually. Yeah,
Uncle.
He was my Uncle Peter. He's my who was he was the brother of my father-in-law. They were both kind of sort of beatniks very early on. I think they actually I can never quite get it straight, because you know what it's like with sort of old druggies, but I think they actually sort of they first sort of bought cannabis off black GIs at the end of the war in the Rising Sun on Tottenham Court Road, and certainly then through the 50s, they knew there were a couple of sort of Indian corner shops where you could get bang, as it was then called, under the counter cannabis. So they were very hip to this, and Peter was as soon as Doors of Perception came out, he was like, wow, this sounds great, I've got to get hold of some of this. And so he figured out that Sigma Aldrich, the chemical suppliers, supplied mescaline, and he went out to their warehouse, sort of on the edge of London, and he said, he wasn't quite sure how much to get, so he thought, I'm going to have half a kilo of mescaline sulfate, please. And there's a guy there in the sort of brown coat with all the biros who looked at him and said, well, sir, it's not technically illegal, but we've we've been told that we should be careful who we sell it to. And Peter said, well, I am a physicist. He was working for Kodak at the time, and he was a physicist. But then they went, oh, that's all right, sir. Quite why it's okay for a physicist to have mescaline. And they sold him like this big bag of mescaline, and so that was, I imagine, probably one of the first big batches of mescaline to start circulating in the late 50s in London while it was still legal. Yeah, so that was a story that I'd known for a long time, and kept picking up echoes of.
So there's a nice poetic resonance there in you writing this wonderful book, A Global History of the First Psychedelic Mescaline, which, it does feel like a kind of significant benchmark work, because nobody's really done it before, have they?
No, that's right. I mean, what's happened with the psychedelic renaissance, as you say, psychedelics coming back into the culture. There's kind of the story that everybody gets of the history is that, that psychedelics suddenly appeared in the 1950s, and then in the 1960s they got kind of demonized and shut down, and now we're finally, exploring them and researching them for the first time. And this is a very different story. This is about how actually decades before that, they were studied by science and used by artists, and so it's opening up a whole history that is kind of has been sort of forgotten, a kind of whole prehistory, if you like, of psychedelia. Like what were all these things before the word psychedelics came along to put them in their box.
So do check it out, Mike J's Mescaline, A Global History of the First Psychedelic. Paul, are you tempted to
revisit the past? I'll do it again.
Mike, are you still in
the
game?
I think psychedelics just enrich life enormously. And
I'm actually quite loving your phrase. You did say about it earlier, but it's artifacts of a brain tricked into producing signal from noise. I like that. That's just an analogue. There's no science. It's just the noise from your mind, and you're visualising. I love that idea. I love the concept, because it's no spirituality, nothing at all. It's just about the visuals.
No, that's right. I mean, I think there are lots of nice sort of frameworks that I've come across in this book, including some of the sort of the sort of the Aztecs had kind of hymns and poems about this, where they talked about the world that you went to being like a world. It was like this world that we're in. It's not like another world. You don't go to another realm, but it's like being just stepped up to a higher level of energy. It's like the world of the sun. Where color turns into light, and that's kind of how it feels like to me. I don't feel like I'm contacting God, but I do feel like I'm seeing the world, not in the way that we normally see it, on a higher level in which you notice things you don't normally notice, and things can speak to you in the way they don't normally do.
That's right. There's nothing more boring in other people's visions on drugs. But my one that I remember was it was a frosty morning, and there was purple. The grass turned into purple lobsters, just baying at me, and I still remember it, and I still think that's the best thing out that whole tricky 12-hour period. That was I took that away, and I've still got that, and it made me happier. Makes
exactly.
Me happy,
you don't have to say what
was a benefit.
You don't have to say what it means or make great claims for it. But I don't think life has many more kind of interesting and fascinating things to offer.
I think also, personally speaking, there is that sense that you said there of the being reawoken in some way to the world as you might have seen it before you were 7. Actually, in that, which is when the literal mind kind of gets control, it breaks down that barrier, doesn't it, between the imagination and reality, and there is something wonderful and therapeutic, I would say, about re-entering that phase. My own experience of psychedelics is deeply meaningful. I wouldn't necessarily call it spiritual, but I would say meaningful. And there is, in a world which is frazzled and, you know, we live largely on the surface of things, that seems to be a very valuable experience to engage in.
Yeah, and that's in fact, you know, Alexander Shulgin said very much what you said when he first took mescaline. He said, I'd forgotten that the world was like this. This is exactly what it was like when I was a child, you know. And I think it's, as you say, I think all kinds of things can be therapeutic. They don't have to be done to you by doctors in clinics. I think there are all kinds of ways that, you know, people can kind of take, you know, therapeutic value or kind of be sort of balanced or kind of made more whole or more happy.
So there we have it. Thanks very much, Mike. And you can check out more of Mike's work as well as this book at mikej.net. Thanks, Mike.
Oh, pleasure.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Paul. You've been listening to The Bureau of Lost Culture, focusing on this episode on a global history of the first psychedelic with Mike J. We'll be back next time with more half-remembered, half-lost, forgotten stories of the counterculture. You can check us out at bureauoflostculture.com.